Hey everyone, welcome to another Mind Sketch Studio video. My name is 𝗕𝗿𝘂𝘁𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗍𝒂𝗃 and I am an illustrator. And in this video, I decided to share a very unusual approach in one of my latest illustrations. Usually, all my paintings are made 100% in gouache or 100% in watercolor. But this time, I decided to apply a watercolor wash in the background and see how it works. But that was not the unusual approach I addressed in this illustration. Most of you know that gouache is a very opaque medium and watercolor is a very transparent medium. Most gouache artists, they build up their illustrations starting from thin layers or washes going to thick layers along the way. It means that as long as they apply gouache on the paint, the layers start to become more opaque, and that's exactly what I didn't want to do. So I'm gonna share how I applied watercolor techniques painting this whole illustration, but using gouache instead. So the first thing I did was creating a proof of color. It was basically a smaller sketch with no details, just to check and decide which color background or which overall colors I would like to use in this illustration. This illustration is based on The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's universe. It's an illustration I created portraying Alatar and Palando, the Blue Wizards. They are two of the five 𝗖𝗫, which are Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast, Alatar, and Palando. So most of Tolkien's fans, they know that Alatar and Palando, they went to East, but there's no detail about their journey. So I decided to create an illustration portraying both wizards kind of lost in a forest, looking at the map and deciding which way they would like to go. So before I start painting the final illustration, I applied a masking fluid on the characters before adding the first watercolor wash on the background. I activated my watercolors with water and started to paint with one of the colors I chose from my proof of color sketch. I started to use this large makeup brush to apply water on the paper because I think it was really useful and it was a really cheap brush. It makes the same result as a watercolor or a more expensive mop brush. So this is a very good tip for beginners or even people that wanted to save money. Just go for a standard big makeup brush to add water on the paper. After applying a couple of washes, it was time to remove carefully the masking fluid, and then we would have the free areas to paint our characters and some of the tree branches I left for the final touches. So then it was time to start applying our unusual gouache technique. So basically when I started painting with gouache, I was always driven to finish my work with thicker layers because everybody was telling me gouache is a thick medium, is an opaque medium. But I always wondered why I couldn't achieve the results that I was aiming for. And the answer was very simple, because I started paint with watercolor way earlier than gouache. So I think I got used to the technique and I really love watercolor technique. So I think I was trying to achieve the same watercolor results in my gouache paintings, but I didn't know how to, because I was always driven to start from thin layers to thick layers. And then I realized that, okay, I think I could try to start painting with gouache, but using basically a very washed color or maybe a very thin color on a paper. And instead of starting building up the illustration from the thin layer to a thick layer, I think I can start slowly applying only thin layers of gouache. And this is really tricky because when you start working with watercolor and you start glazing, you realize that you have to let the layer underneath dry first, and then you come up with another second layer of the same color or a new color and you can glaze. But using this technique with gouache, which is an opaque medium, you wonder, okay, is that possible to glaze or not? Is that possible to create the same glazing effect? when I use watercolor? Yes, it is. You only have to keep in mind that gouache is reactivated with water. So if you apply a very watery layer and paint with a very strong touch on paper, you most likely will smudge your color and create a muddy effect, and this is not what you want. So basically you have to let the layer underneath dry first, and then you have to paint with a very soft, a very gentle touch on the paper in order to create the glazing effect and gradient effects as you do painting with watercolor. And why do I love this technique? Because we can have the best of both worlds in the same illustration. We can have the translucency of the watercolor in some light areas, and in some dark areas we can have a very solid and opaque area with only a couple of thin layers of gouache. And that's when the magic happens. Once gouache is a very opaque medium, you don't necessarily have to build up your illustration with a very thick layer in some areas. You can have the same opacity with only a few thin layers of gouache paint. Of course, the result is not going to be 100% like watercolor because they are two different mediums and they both have their own aspects. But working with glazing techniques in thin layers, really worth it. Once I finished all the painting with gouache, it was time to create some really nice effects using colored pencils. I don't usually go for colored pencils because I'm a kind of old style traditional illustrator and I always like to create all the effects with a brush. But sometimes when you decided to go for a very specific technique, pretty much the one that I described in this video, it would be really hard to create this very light effect only with gouache. I would probably disturb the layers underneath, and that's why I decided to work with colored pencils to create these lighting effects. After using the colored pencils in some areas, it was time to wrap up the illustration with highlights. The reason why I leave all the highlights for the very end is because when you finish up an illustration, sometimes you do not have enough contrast between the darkest areas and the lightest areas. And the gouache technique is very versatile because you can either go for a very sharp edge and a very crispy highlight with the ink coming out from the tube, or you can glaze thin layers of white color in some areas. Oh, but that's not gonna reactivate the color underneath? Yes, and that's what you want, because sometimes highlights are not only white, sometimes you wanna just light up the color to create the real contrast that you are aiming for, and that's why you have to apply the watery layers of white ink. So as long as you apply these layers and glaze, the color underneath are gonna change to a lighter color, and then you can let it dry, and if you want to finish that with a very sharp and a very white highlight over it, you can do that. So I hope you guys liked the video, I hope you guys enjoyed this illustration process, and I really hope you guys apply this amazing technique, which is glazing with only gouache. It's a technique that's really worth it. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.